And give me a second.
Yep. I don't know why it says I can release my video order here. Does that matter?
You're good.
Give me a second.
Okay.
We are up.
I don't know why it says I can release my video order here. Does that matter?
All right, Jessica, you're good to go. We are live.
Okay. I think I hear an echo. Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this very snowy Athens evening in Southeast Ohio. You know, in a normal year, we would be worried about canceling a program like this on an evening with so much snow in our forecast. But this year, we are lucky enough to be doing this program virtually. So for those of you who are joining us from around Southeast Ohio, welcome. And for those of you who are joining us from around the country, because you are now able to see us do a program virtually, we are so glad that you are here. I want to take a couple of minutes to say thank you to all of our members and supporters who have helped make this event possible and who have kept the History Center alive and collecting history for the past year. We could not do this without you. So if you have donated to us or renewed your membership or become a new member in the last year, thank you so much. We really appreciate your support. I also want to say thank you to the team at Envisage Wealth for sponsoring this evening's program and for sponsoring the entire Dig Deeper speaker series. We will be hosting virtual programs on the third Thursday every other month. Our next program is on Thursday, April 15th at 5:30 p.m. and I'll be giving you some more details on that at the end of this evening's talk. This evening, however, I would like to welcome Dr. David Torbett of Marietta College, who is the editor of the Autobiography of Daniel Parker, Frontier Universalist, which was published by Ohio University Press in 2020. David Torbett is a professor of religion and history at Marietta College, and he joined the faculty there in 2007. Before that, he taught at Mount Union and Ashland University. He has a PhD in historical theology from Union Seminary in Virginia. His other book is The Theology in Slavery, Charles Hodge and Horace Bushnell, which was published by Mercer University Press in 2006. He will be speaking this evening for about 45 minutes, and then we will have a time at the end where we can ask him questions. Now, because this is a virtual event, we are asking that you please type your questions into the chat on YouTube, and then we will moderate those questions and relay those to David so that he can answer them for you live. If he doesn't get to all of the questions live, that's okay. We can actually send them to him and he can respond to them and put them in the comments on our YouTube page. So we hope that you enjoy Dr. David Torbett, and we're looking forward to this evening's event.
Well, I want to thank Jessica and the Southeast Ohio History Center and everyone working there to make this event work. And I will just go ahead and get right to it. So I'm David Torbett, and as she said, the book that I edited is by Daniel Parker. And I will go ahead and begin by starting a PowerPoint. Excuse me, I started at the ending. So I hope you can see everything that I see. I'll just ask Jessica, who can still hear me, to demute herself and tell me if there's something technically going wrong. For example, if you're not seeing the pictures that I think you're seeing. Anyway, let us begin. So, as I said, this was my original title, Overcoming Evil with Good, because it was something that Daniel Parker liked to say. And here is what the cover of the book looks like. It was a scripture verse that he liked to quote a lot from Romans. Okay, so here is the cover of the book and some statements from Ohio University Press. All right, so back to my PowerPoint. So you should also be seeing my title now, and now you should be seeing a picture of Daniel Parker. This man, Daniel Parker, was born in Newburyport, Mass, 1781, and he migrated with his family. His father was one of the original stockholders in the Ohio Company, which bought many acres here in Ohio, and they were going to be the first official authorized settlers from the relatively new United States to settle in what was then the Western territories. Of course, there were lots of people out here already, both indigenous people and people who had just came on their own from the East. But he came with that official group, and they stopped over for quite a few years in Western Pennsylvania, but that was still, for him, that was still the frontier. And he lived in a log cabin and grew up there with his family. He was 7 years old when he came out, and a young man when they finally, after the Treaty of Greenville, they felt safe enough to come to Meigs County, Ohio, where his father had his land. And then he had other adventures in his life. I'm skipping ahead and not covering the most important thing, which was his faith journey. And I'm just talking about the ordinary events in his life, or let me say the what he would call sort of the natural events in his life before I get back to his faith journey. So one of the things he did, and one of the things that this document covers, is his travels where he was selling a newly invented washing machine. He was a carpenter and a mechanic, and he was making them. Someone else was doing the selling. And they traveled down to New Orleans by flatboat, and then they came back via the Natchez Trace, and then through Ohio and Kentucky, stopping a long time in the way. It was kind of a wilderness journey for him, trying to make enough money basically to come back with his head held high. And he finally did come back home, and he also got married to Priscilla Malloy Ring. By the way, the painting, the portrait of Daniel Parker that I showed at the beginning, and this portrait of his wife, Priscilla Malloy Ring Parker, were by the American portraitist John Frankenstein. That's his name, John Frankenstein. You can look him up. He's a real portraitist. Anyway, he married. They bought a home near Cincinnati that he named Mount Hygiene because he thought it was a good and healthy place to be. And that's his property there on the Ohio River near New Richmond, Ohio. So, and also on that same property, they built a secondary school, a boarding school, a high school. It was one of the first private secondary schools in Ohio, and it was the only racially integrated, the first racially integrated secondary school in Ohio, racially integrated and coeducational. Of course, Oberlin University was the first university, but this was the first secondary school. So those are some things in his life. He died in 1861. How did I happen to come upon doing this and writing this story that I should reiterate? Most of it, that was sort of the outward trappings of his life, but most of it is about his inward journey and his theological conclusions done in the context of his real life. How did this come to me? There was a relative, Dr. James D. Parker, who lives now in Maryland, and he had inherited this manuscript that you had seen in the background a minute ago. And a historian from the West Virginia Park Services, Ray Swick, was a champion of the manuscript. It had been passed down from generation to generation and had now and then been borrowed and quoted in some fairly well-known, I guess, family histories, but had not been made into a book, and now it's a book. And that was one thing that that he and his family members wanted to do, and so they lent it to Marietta College. Marietta College has been very supportive of the project in many ways. Meanwhile, at Northern Kentucky University, their archaeology department, their history department, and public history department have been doing a archaeology project. And they have been, and I'm going to go to the link here. They've been on a dig to find on the old buildings of the old secondary school. So here's some people involved, including Brian Hackett, who's a professor of public theology, and Greg Roberts, who actually owns some of the property. And here is another one of these pictures, and here are some people on the dig. And part of that, let's see. Yes, I do want to close tabs. Part of that project was that other family members had donated a lot of other sources in addition to the autobiography. The autobiography was just, well, here, I'll show you in a minute. And that's Margaret McDiarmid and Walter Colvin, their brother and sister, and they donated some, and she donated some documents. He donated the photos of those John Frankenstein portraits. Anyway, there are the pages of the autobiography, so you can look at it. It's about 14 octavo notebooks that are sewn together, making about 300 handwritten pages like that, which reduced down to less printed pages. My book has a fairly long introduction and a lot of notes, which is what they asked for, a lot of historical context. So at first, I was not so excited about writing what I thought might be someone else's family history when it was brought to my attention. But then as I got into the book, I found it to be very interesting, even though I did not know this person. First of all, because he watches things. He's a witness to history. Secondly, it's because of that spiritual journey that he documents that I told you about. And thirdly, it's just a human story. So I'll try to get to all those points. First, a witness to history. But before the first, I just want you to give you the very first sentence from the very first page. So, Autobiography of Daniel Parker began to be written at the request of his family and friends, mostly from memory in the 64th year of his age, 1845. I will say every now and then he addresses an audience in his writing. And I think he had hoped that at some point he would get a broader audience beyond his family members. So now at last he has it, 175 years later. Okay, that's the last sentence. It says, "Be careful of me and return me," because he didn't want people to lose his manuscript. So he was lending it out, but he wanted it to be returned. So as a witness to history, well, in addition to recording his inner life, he pays attention to what's happening around him. He's kind of like a Forrest Gump of the old frontier. He just wanders into events. Sometimes he's not a very punctual Forrest Gump. He's sometimes too early, he's sometimes too late, but he wanders into things. He witnesses George Washington leading troops in West Pennsylvania. Doesn't see Washington himself, but sees the troops being mustered to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, an insurrection from people who didn't want to pay their taxes. So there he goes, marching right by. He mentions the Treaty of Greenville, and after the Treaty of Greenville, that was what allowed many, many more settlers from the East to pour into Ohio, and he mentions that, and he was among them. He's a witness to slavery, and the troubling of his heart over slavery, and then eventually his very forthright anti-slavery stance and activism, is, I would say, the second most important theme of the book after his faith journey and his concern about, finding salvation. And he, as I said, he wanders into things. Well, he stayed in Grinder's lodging house almost exactly 1 year after Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark had died there. And he talked to Priscilla Grinder. She was his landlady, and she was the last person to see him alive. And he mentions not so much battles, but the effects of the War of 1812 on the people of Kentucky while he's traveling, the moral reform movement of the 1830s. And so those are just among the things he observes and comments on. Oh, the earthquake of New Madrid. That was the most powerful earthquake to hit the U.S. He bought land that was sunk by the earthquake. So various things like that he sees. He also just, in addition to kind of stumbling into events and trends, he has a general picture of how things changed out here in Southeast Ohio. I'm now in Marietta, and which is not far from Athens, Ohio. I'm close to where he lived at one point. He takes note of the things people use. He takes note of the current technology and, of course, commerce. He's a traveling salesman. Here is the entry of list of patents for these years. These are all the different washing machines that were invented that same year. And he lists them all, and they're listed all in this. And this is the one by the inventor Eli F. Hill that he was trying to market. He witnesses social customs. He keeps tabs of the Scots-Irish dialect that people speak in Western Pennsylvania while he lives there. He pays attention to plants and animals and the natural landscape on his travels. And these are whortleberries, which he sees growing on Pilot Rock, and he mentions them. They're also called huckleberries. And just seeing the change from what used to be considered the frontier territory to becoming the Midwestern United States. Finally, he starts out in a flatboat, but he ends up in a steamboat, his anecdotes. He's also a witness to American religion. So he's traveling around outwardly, but he's also traveling around inwardly to find the truth for himself. He is brought up a Presbyterian, so he's exposed to the Calvinism that was so influential in American religion. There's Jonathan Edwards, who preached the sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. And it was those hellfire sermons that he ran away from and finally led him to embrace his own ideas. He's a witness to the revivals of the Second Great Awakening and the growth of the Methodist and Baptist denomination. And he has a lot in common with them, though he has some differences as well. He takes note of marginal groups. One thing about Daniel Parker, compared to another biographer who documents the same time and place, Peter Cartwright, is his open-mindedness. I think it's fair to say he was more open-minded than Peter Cartwright, who really, most of his autobiography is his argument for the truth of the Methodist Church. He was trying to find the truth, and he was asking various people and inquiring various people, watching the Shakers do their dance and hear their preaching in a Shaker community in Kentucky, having an open conversation with a Catholic priest who actually happened to be an important person in American Catholic religious history. It was the priest who actually ended up buying the land for Notre Dame. Anyway, drawing a blank right now on his name. But anyway, we might not think of Catholics as being marginal groups, but they were in the United States. And the hostility between Catholics and Protestants is a big part of the story of the 18th century and the 19th century. So for him to have an open-minded conversation with Theodore Baden, it finally came to me. Theodore Baden, or Badin, if you want to give the French pronunciation, the first priest ordained in the United States by Bishop John Carroll. For him to have an open-minded conversation is just a testament to who he is, and it's an interesting record of the religious diversity on the American frontier, including these independent seekers, a foot washer, who wanted to follow the teachings of Jesus, that followers should wash their disciples' feet, And he asked if he could wash Daniel Parker's and his brothers. And he said, although it was not our way of thinking, we consented. And that was just the attitude he had. And also talking to Enlightenment-informed deists and pantheists and self-styled mystics. So he had conversations with people like that as well. One of the most interesting things about him is he provides, I think, the only firsthand account of any length from a member, as opposed to the leader, from a member of Abel Sargent's Halcyon Church. So the Halcyon Church was this apocalyptic alternative religion on the American frontier. And it shows up in various ways in American history and in various misunderstood ways. So it was a big phenomenon at the time, hundreds of members, and hundreds is a big number at the time, and thousands of interested seekers who would come hear him. And also a lot of controversy that often surrounds these new religious movements like this. It was an apocalyptic movement to add to it, and a very countercultural one. This canard that's mentioned in Fawn Brody's biography of Joseph Smith, where she just uses him spelled with a different spelling for his name, is just an example of the crazy things that were happening in the frontier, and saying that he preached the odd doctrine that a sufficiently holy person could live without food, and a convert put the belief to the test and went 9 days without eating and died. That's a misunderstanding of what really happened. And Daniel Parker was there for what really happened. So it's insight into Abel Sargent and the Halcyon Church, and that mystery that flourished and faded on the American frontier. He's mentioned also in Nathan Hatch's Democratization of American Christianity, and which is from the 1990s, and 21st century sources as well. But he's shrouded in a lot of mystery as well. So this says a lot about him. Here are some things we do know about him: when he was born, when he died. And he was from Maryland. He came to Ohio. He felt personally called to start this new movement. It was, on the one hand, a marginalized sect, but on the other hand, characteristically American, because it had things like a living prophet and people interpreting the Bible for themselves, and charismatic leadership, and a kind of anti-establishment attitude that makes it seem at once marginalized and at once sort of characteristic of other American religious organizations. Various influences on it: the Enlightenment, evangelicalism, even the Jewish Kabbalah. But what's really crazy is how this movement anticipates later ones, and in the most uncanny way, the Latter-day Saints, with a lot of the language, like and with a living prophet, and with terms like the Restored Church of Jesus Christ, and calling their community Zion. So that's an extraordinary, interesting thing. There hasn't been any evidence of Joseph Smith, reading anything by Abel Sargent. But it is the truth that Abel Sargent's son and namesake became one of the first generation Mormons. So Daniel Parker joined this group, partly running from his Calvinist background and his rejection of this idea of predestination, double predestination, and the idea that people don't have the freedom to accept or reject salvation, or that Jesus didn't die to save everyone. So he was looking for a church, or he was found by a church that offered a more, you might say, fluid and free will emphasizing understanding of salvation, something that focused on free will. And that was why he was attracted to the Halcyon Church. Other churches were offering similar alternatives at the time, but this is what found him first. So that was one thing that drew him, was that affirmation of human free will and the sort of universal love of Christ who died for everybody. It was millennial, so they were expecting a coming new age, a coming end of time, a coming reign of Christ. And sometimes Abel Sargent would speak of it in very this worldly language. And he called it the real republicanism, meaning sort of the real democracy, the real people-led government. And he talked about the the change in the doing away of all ordinary injustices like slavery or economic inequality. So in a lot of ways, it seemed like it could just substitute for natural progress, except one thing. He did predict that the coming millennium would involve the resurrection of the dead, and that this would be, the beginning of a new age that all people would enjoy together, except not everybody, because the people who were recalcitrantly rejecting goodness, the recalcitrantly wicked and the faithless would not be sent to hell. So he rejected the idea of hell, and that was another idea that appealed to Daniel Parker. He wasn't a full-on universalist because he believed that the people who rejected, salvation, Christ, God, would just die and cease to exist, but there wouldn't be any kind of eternal torment. That idea of conditional immortality is related to that. People don't have immortal souls, but they have immortality as a gift, to get a little bit technical for you. And he considered himself the messenger. He didn't like the word prophet because he thought that belonged to another age. So the messenger was in fact Abel Sargent. And he was concerned with economic justice and slavery. Like a lot of apocalyptic groups, you compare the bad now with the better future. You compare the bad now with the better future. And the bad now would be economic injustice and slavery, and the better future would be the end of these things. You also criticize all kinds of institutions bordering on anarchy, and the group he went after the most were the established churches, Catholic and Protestant, mostly Protestant, and the ones that he had a lot in common with, because he was establishing his own alternative community, and especially the trained clergy, the priests, the ministers, the preachers, the ones who went to school, the ones who got paid. They were, he would say, they were the ones who corrupted the gospel. So strong anti-clerical strand. By the way, in the back are some of his journals that were published. And then he interpreted the scripture figuratively and had this whole mystical system of Urim and Thummim, which is, not really to summarize, but just to give you a clue, it's based on terms from the Old Testament. Some of you may recognize them, a divining device from the Old Testament. And it was a kind of whole system, a mystical system of virtues. And it was a way of explaining faith and salvation that was an alternative to the popular substitutionary atonement theory of the time. And it was actually an idea that Daniel Parker continued to embrace even after he left the Halcyon Church, which he did after this crisis event. And actually there was trouble leading up to it. So Daniel Parker and his brother John, who had also joined, who had also become traveling ministers for the Halcyon Church, on a circuit, traveling around from what's now West Virginia into Ohio, on a regular circuit, just like the Methodists did, and preaching to these congregations who accepted Sargent's teachings. Well, a few years into it, he began to get restless, as he often did, and he began to think that and he and some others within the group, including a woman, Ms. Fordyce, believed that, Rhoda Fordyce, believed that in order to sort of bring the millennium forward, the believers had to go through a period of intense privation. So they did a very serious fast in 1807. I'm giving it away here. A very serious fast. And they were basically headquartered in Washington, Pennsylvania, which was on that preaching route. But he gave up the preaching route because they had basically started a group within a group. It was sort of like a schism. Abel Sargent did not approve of the fast. So they went down to eating only vegetables. They didn't go without food entirely, and devoted themselves to prayer and fasting, depriving themselves of every luxury. About 12 of what he called pilgrims. Among them was a fellow named Amos Parkhurst. And Amos Parkhurst had the ability to go into deep trance. He borrows the term from spiritualism and calls it magnetic sleep, and says he would go so asleep that he appeared to be dead. You'd hold a glass up to his mouth and you wouldn't see the steam on the glass. And just when they were about to panic, he would come out of it and he would give this incredible testimony and be full of strength and vigor and throw a log on the fire and then give incredible testimony of the visions he'd had while he was under trance. And he did it several times, and Daniel Parker reports a healing miracle that he did. And then one time he went under and he stayed under, and then he didn't come up. He had died. Then what they said was they waited a while before they buried him because they wanted to make sure that he had really died, because he had gone into trance for hours, even days before. When they were certain that he had died, they, of course, had the funeral for him. No sooner was it known in the surrounding neighborhood that the most extravagant lies were set on foot. Some said we had killed him, others that we had been trying for 3 days to raise him from the dead. And these rumors that he reports happening end up in local histories that were written after the time that Daniel Parker wrote, but obviously with no access to his writing. So they were rumors that were handed down, spread around, found their way into local histories, and then found their way into Fawn Brody's book and to other books, even in the 20th and 21st century, that had all kinds of different variations, including the one you saw, that would say that someone tried to go for 40 days without food, or various other things that weren't quite what happened. And there's the report of what really did happen. So in some ways, mystery solved. And I do trust his report as being more reliable, because you can trace his recording of the rumors and the rumors going to other sources. And then you can see his independent attestation from his own witness. So that's one of the interesting things about his story. Then religiously, he breaks with the Halcyon Church, and he finally embraces Universalism, which is different from what the Halcyons believed. The Halcyon Church belief was that no one would go to hell, but not everyone would live forever in heaven. Universalism is that everybody would have a blessed existence with God, that no one would be lost. No one you could think of would be lost. The whole human family would be reunited to God. Universal salvation. This was it has been an alternative Christian theological position, not the majority position, but an alternative one going back, thousands of years to the time of Origen. And some would argue even before. Some people may try to make the case that the Apostle Paul was a Universalist. Certainly, Daniel Parker believed that his conclusions were based on Scripture. And he was not the only one. So there were several. Movement started in England, came to the US, but many people like Daniel Parker just came to these conclusions on their own. Eventually, like-minded people joined together in a church called first the General Convention, then the Universalist Church in America. And then in 1961, they merged with another liberal denomination to form the Unitarian Universalist Society. Anyway, back to Daniel Parker. And his time, Universalism was a grassroots movement. The Unitarians, that was the other group. They were from Boston. They went to Harvard, a lot of them. But the Universalist, who emphasized this universal love of God, other than that, their language is pretty traditionally Christian, except for the rejection of hell, was more grassroots. And Daniel Parker himself never had more than 2 years in school, of formal schooling. Self-educated people who came to these conclusions from the Bible and then just traveled around and preached it, just like the Methodists did. It doesn't matter that there was no hell to fear. It was important for people to know. One thing about Daniel Parker, though, is he didn't think everybody got the complete thing right away. He believed that there'd be kind of a purgative period after death, and in which people would be gradually restored, meaning they would be, further converted and experience new life and continue to change and become better people until they finally experience the fullness of salvation. He wouldn't call it purgatory, neither would the others, but that's pretty much what it was. So there was another side that called the ultra side that believed in what they called death and glory, which meant as soon as you died, you go to heaven. Daniel Parker was on the restorationist side. I think it was partly jumping ahead to his views on slavery. There had to be some justice. Even if there was no hell, there had to be some justice after death, rewards and punishments for all the injustices he had seen. But he still hoped that everyone would be reunited. And he wrote about it in a book. So this is his first published book. His second published book is the one I'm promoting. It's 175 years later. But this is his first published book and his only published book for 175 years, in which he tried to defend his ideas. He would travel around to basically, he'd teach in a hemp factory, a rope factory. He would preach on the butcher block. He would preach in houses. He would preach in meeting houses. And for briefly, he had his own church in Cincinnati. And he wrote this book. So those were his ideas. And his slogan was the final restoration of all the human family, from sin to holiness, and consequently from misery to happiness. I'll say, why was it so important to tell people that they were all going to be saved if there was no hell to go to or fear? It was because he needed people to work to make the world better. Because it wasn't just about the afterlife for Daniel Parker. You work towards the restoration of the human family in this life with the anticipation that it would be perfected later on. And I'll get back to that when I get to his anti-slavery. I want to talk about slavery for him. So his major moral concern was slavery. Matter of fact, I'll transition right now. So for him to be what he called a restorationist, which meant a restorationist universalist, it wasn't enough to just hope for heaven in the far, far future. You had to bring about reconciliation of the human family now. And you had to do away with all kinds of human evil. And the worst kind of human evil, that he believed needed to be done away with was American slavery. This was a position that he came to over time. He never liked it whenever he was exposed to it. He became more exposed to it on his journey through the South, through Virginia, Kentucky, down south, along the Mississippi to New Orleans and back through Tennessee and Kentucky. So he saw some evil things. The worst thing he saw was a murder. Someone who was, some of you may know about the domestic slave trade and someone being imported to Natchez Trace. He saw an enslaved man, knocked off a boat by a slave trader and was killed, and tried to alert people about it, tried to even find a coroner for him, and people just laughed at him. So he and his business partner buried them himself. What business partner? Well, it would be Mr. Bingham. And I need to say something about him later. Anyway, the one who helped him tried to sell the washing machine. So he saw these evils on his trip. He gradually became more convinced and more open about it. Like many Americans, he believed that he went for the first available solution, which was to work for the American Colonization Society. So a little bit about that, which some of you out there may have heard of. That was the plan to resettle freed former slaves, American slaves, in Africa, in Liberia, in what became the nation of Liberia. That began as a colony of the American Colonization Society. That was seen as the solution to the problem of a biracial society. I think it's fair to call it a genuinely anti-slavery effort, but it was based on racist assumptions. The black and white people couldn't get along together in America after black people were free, and it was up to black people to leave. Eventually, he saw the evils of that within a few years and began to abhor the evils of it. And so like many Americans, including William Lloyd Garrison, he moved away from the gradual emancipation and voluntary manumission by slaveholders and the colonization project, which is really an expatriation project, and became a full-blown abolitionist, which is someone who demands the abolition of slavery immediately. without this idea and that Black people will become, full American participants in American society, not to be sent some other place. So that was his movement, like many others, and that was his preoccupation during the last part of his life. So he would travel around promoting abolition and other things, other moral causes, in addition to promoting universal salvation. He saw them all as a piece. So I think it's fair to say he was a convinced abolitionist and did what good he could, but he was ambivalent on race, like many Americans, like every American still, I would say, including myself. He had a lot of racism to unlearn. I don't think he was more racist than most other white people. I think he was actually less racist than most other white people, but he had this strange event in his life. While he was traveling through Kentucky during the War of 1812, there was a family, and the men in the family went to fight, and he volunteered to take care of the family and the farm while they were away. And it turned out the farm, these were a family who had taken care of him, so he thought he owed them some kindness. But taking care of the farm meant basically overseeing a hemp plantation that was worked by slaves. And so he was, in his own terms, he was a slave overseer for 6 weeks in 1812. And he said some very unfortunate things. For some reason, he was just surprised when enslaved people weren't always happy to do their work and weren't always honest about finishing their work, in his language, honest, and would sometimes sabotage the work. He never really understood that this might have been not just the demoralization of slavery, which is how he defined it, but also a kind of rebellion, the best rebellion they could do. So that was his ambivalence. But I will say a few things to his credit. First of all, on a spectrum, he was more on the egalitarian side at the time for most white people, and I give examples of others, in this place, right on the border of the Ohio River, on these borderlands between slavery and race, in Southeast Ohio. The other was, he did recognize it wasn't, that it was the ill effects of slavery that created these problems. And he said it was much more demoralizing for white people who had, are privileged by slavery. The moral corruption was much more evident among them. And then finally, the importance of his latter life, and especially he and his wife and his son, by that time an adult son, started Clermont Academy. And at that time, he was a very public abolitionist. And so they knew when the first African-American student was offered, to enroll, that they had to be racially integrated, and they were. So the school was run by his son, James Parker, who had a 50-year career and had educated many people who had led various professions and went to various colleges, men and women. And reading about those documents about the school, there is the building, the main dormitory and classroom when it still stood on his property. And that's what's being explored by the archaeological project now. So there's a postcard called Clermont Academy. And so it was run by the family, and they always had plenty of students. It began with, the plan was that the oldest son would go to college, he'd learn something, come back and teach the rest, teach his brothers and sisters. It was just an effort to have a secondary education for Daniel Parker's children. He had 7 children, but it expanded to include others as a boarding school, and it had students from Ohio and Kentucky, black and white, male and female, taught in, as he said, the same apartment, meaning the same classroom. So they had this 2-page pamphlet is everything you need to know. They printed, and there's James Parker, who, by the way, took a year off to be the first professor at Wilberforce, the historically black university. Then he came back to continue the Clermont Academy, and he was the principal teacher for as long as it existed. There's his wife, Mrs. Parker, and his daughter, Fanny Currier, who are also on staff. There is the whole curriculum for 4 years, but it says if you're going to college, we can talk about, offers the option for people to set up their own curriculum if they plan to go to a university. All the expenses, $10 a term, 2 terms a year. I think it was 2 terms a year. And how to pay, everything you're supposed to pack, all on 2 pages. That was the advantage of having no board of directors and running everything themselves. And then they had these public speaking things every year, where the students would give their speeches on things like no excellence without labor, and the permanency of our institutions, and dialogues and other things. And they'd also do music. That's another thing about Daniel Parker. He was a musician. And so he played music, and so did he played fiddle, flute, and so did his sons. And they'd have public speakers. And of course they'd have prayers. Okay. So he had his limitations, and that's what made it a human story. And one part of his story was Priscilla. Priscilla was as much the driving force behind Clermont Academy as anything else, and was the love of his life, but not the first love of his life. He'd been rejected earlier, and that's part of the story also, is being rejected by the daughter of a planter in Kentucky. But he found her, who was a widow who had had a child who had died, but they remarried and had 7 children together. She was very outspoken in what she believed to be just causes, and very energetic. And at times, she was a teacher, and at times she supported the family financially. And Daniel Parker, to his credit, acknowledged that and thanked her for it, and was not ashamed of that. He also talked about how important it was to be a mother to his children. So he bought into that, cult of true womanhood, but not so much that he didn't acknowledge her genius, really, and her energy. One thing she did was she was much more forthright in her, that's how he described being in love, an agreeable kind of dread. That was his first experience. And that's what he called Priscilla, my best earthly friend. Here's her letter telling her local Baptist church to take a stronger stand against slavery. And she also comes out against the Mexican-American War, which he sees as a war to defend slavery. So that was something she wanted to make her Baptist church take a stronger stand. She was a Baptist, Daniel Parker was not. Here's a funny thing. Daniel Parker was not very good at converting members of his own family. But that was sort of his style. He said, unless I'm asked, I don't really speak about restoration even to my own family. And I don't think it was, I don't think it was just that he was shy. I think it had to do with his whole principle of tolerance and understanding, and with the understanding that doctrinal differences are not insignificant. It was important for him to go and talk to everyone who wanted to hear about universal salvation. But it wasn't ultimate. What was ultimate was people working together to bring the world a little bit closer to the reconciliation that he knew was coming. So that's why I think he's still a significant person today. He had his human limitations, but he also had his strengths. When he believed something to be true and just and right, he pursued it. When he believed himself to be wrong, he corrected himself, all the wrongs that he saw. He was not arrogant, but he knew he had the gift of speaking and people would respond to it. So he used those gifts. And he kept up his, hope in reconciliation for all people to the day he died. He, on his deathbed, he said he had just hoped that he could live to see the end of slavery. This was 1861. All the evangelical denominations had divided over slavery, and it was on the verge of the bloodiest war that the country would ever have. I'm seeing a lot of chats here. It looks like I should wind it up. But he continued to hope for reconciliation because he believed that's what God wanted. And who knows that he's not right, because it's not something that ends in this time. It's something that ends in the first future. It's time and eternity he can find together. And he said, I hope to see them into slavery, but maybe I will see it from another perspective, from another shore. And I hope that he did. So I will stop now and go to questions. Okay, so I will open my chat here. Okay, so here's a few questions. And I realized people were asking their questions on YouTube, and you have to have a YouTube account to ask on YouTube. So there might be many people out there who had questions that were not able to ask them. So I'll just go ahead and answer them, if that's okay. And I hope I've been heard. I hope I've not just been moving in my mouth this whole time and showing y'all pictures. Anyway, did Daniel Parker comment on the Treaty of Greenville or the Indian Removal Act? Implicitly, he did. He said the Indians were always fair with us, and I wish I could say that our country had been fair to them. So he recognized the injustice with which that the indigenous people were treated with. And so when I say there were two sides to him, and one was very egalitarian, the reason he thought slavery was wrong is because it didn't stand up to the Golden Rule. And he thought that Native Americans were not being treated by the Golden Rule either. So in general, I would say he recognized the injustice that was done by indigenous people to the American government. Well, what led him to move further down the Ohio River instead of staying in Marietta or near Marietta? I think it was partly that it was for economic reasons. He was still sort of selling that washing machine after he came back, and he had kind of connections there. And so that was partly why. And then he stayed there, and then that was where he met his wife. And also he met a very interesting fellow, a deist, who introduced him to his wife. And so who ended up becoming James Kennedy, ended up becoming the namesake for his son, James Kennedy Parker. And so he met his wife there, and then he found the land for Mount Hygiene, and he fell in love with it, and he bought the land there. Archives. I went to Marietta College Archive, which was what the thing was donated to, and it also had letters by him. There's material that was donated to Northern Kentucky University. I went to the Gallipolis Historical and Genealogical Society, and I went a lot on the internet, and I used familytree.com to trace down a lot of biographies. And so those are some of the things I did. So I have a lot of notes. Here's the book, which I think the press made a very attractive book, I have to say. There's some of these pictures, these photos are from Northern Kentucky University. There's a photo of the school. There's the circular that I showed you. And here are my notes. If you buy the book, you don't have to read them all, but there are a lot of notes and a lot of historical background. And I have my introduction also. So what the experience was like was long, hard. At one point, Daniel Parker literally came to me in a dream and said, when is that thing going to be published? But in a nicer way, because he always spoke nicer than that. But I'm not kidding. He looked just like himself too. So it actually explains in the introduction how long it took, because there were two submissions. And that was one part of it. And last question. After spending so much time with Daniel Parker, do you think you'd get along with him if you met him? You know, I regard him as a member of my own family. And here's the thing. He hoped that this book would be something that would help others, that it would remind them of the difficulties he went through when they went through a period of famine on the frontier, that it would help people who were struggling to find the truth and give them some hope for salvation, and that he would witness to advocate for moral causes that he believed in. And he just wanted people to hear these things and wanted his life to help others. And he wrote it at the request of family and friends. So it's just a real privilege to be able to make it be seen by others. He was an open person, so I think he would have been nice to talk to. Yes, he was also, he hated profane language, and he was a teetotaler, but he was not terribly judgmental of other people. So I think I would get along with him, and I think y'all would too. Okay, so that's all I have. Thank you very much.
you so much, David. You know, I'm so glad that you gave that shout out to the archives, especially Marietta College's archives are just incredible. And the people who staff them are so professional and they are so passionate about preserving that early history of our state and our nation. And I feel like I just can't praise archives and museums enough. Of course, I'm a little biased, but that is, it's always great to hear from someone else who appreciates the work that we do preserving these stories because they are important and significant.
And I have a long list of acknowledgments of all the people that have helped, including the people in our special collections here at Marietta College.
That's wonderful. So thank you again so much for agreeing to be our very first speaker in this speaker series and our debut on YouTube. I know that we had a few bugs that we needed to work out, but it sounded and looked great. So I am just so happy that you were willing to be a part of this. And of course, I hope that in a post-COVID era, you'd be willing to come to the History Center and sign some of your books.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. And I can be found on email through Marietta College if people want to ask me other questions.
Wonderful. Well, just to let everybody know, our next speaker is April 15th. That is the third Thursday in April at 5:30 p.m. We will be welcoming Professor John Ballinger of Mount Vernon Nazarene University. He is a professor of English and the director of the Writing Center there. He will be speaking on the symbolism of objects in our everyday lives, and especially relating that to the poets of Southeast Ohio, which I think will be fascinating. You may have noticed that we are looking at collecting objects from members of our community who have objects that may have significant stories to them. And so this talk will kind of tie into that on how we prescribe meaning to sometimes very ordinary objects. So I hope that you will join us for that. That will be broadcast live on our YouTube channel and available afterwards, just as this one is. So thank you again to David Torbett and to all of you for watching. And thank you again to the team at Envisage Wealth for sponsoring this virtual series. We hope to see you again in